my name's John Mangiapane, and I'm from Waterbury, Connecticut. There are a variety of things that I have done through my life, but mostly they've all concerned sewing, which I've been doing since I've been 8 years old, so about 50 years. So somehow we're going to manage to squeeze what I do, which is either sewing or writing books, into a couple of episodes and a couple of online extras that we're going to create. I mostly am known as being a sewer, and that covers quilting, which we will show you some of my quilts. It does cover cross-stitching, and what I did mostly for a professional job was costume designing and sewing. I am an author. I have several, actually 9 at this point, books that I have published, and a couple of them are children's stories, and we will talk about those in another segment. And one of the things in our special segments we're going to create is I have designed my own deck of tarot cards, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later. This is my sewing. My mother taught me to sew when I was a little boy, but she didn't really actually teach me embroidery, which is what I do, which is counted cross-stitch mostly. And some people aren't familiar with counted cross-stitch, and it's basically designs that are created on an even weave fabric using dozens and dozens of stitches and dozens of colors. Sometimes they can get very, very realistic, like this hummingbird, which is actually, I'd say, almost life-size on this towel. These are very simple things that I have done through my course of my life, but I tend to do very complicated artworks, and that's what I'm going to show you tonight. I have 4 of them with me. This particular one, I did 3 of these last year, and I entered all of them in the Eastern States Exposition for 2013. And for my 3 pieces, I actually won 4 prizes. I won 1 second prize, 2 first prizes, and I won a Founders Award for Excellence in Surface Embroidery, which surprised everything out of me when I actually won that award. But I'm here to show you basically that it sounds like it's really difficult. It isn't. It's basically only 1 stitch. It's a crossed X, but you can do some very complicated effects with it. And this is one of them over here, Marzipan, who is a carousel horse. Story about 2 of this one in the next picture. I actually forgot I had these at one point in my life. A whole lot of business was going on, and I found the fabric for this in a frame and said, I don't know what this is for, and found out it was for this particular horse kit, and it probably had been sitting around for about 12 to 14 years at that point. It only took me 2.5 months to stitch him, but he was relatively uncomplicated. He's the middle project of the 3 that I did. But he got a second prize, and I'm actually not surprised, but it's for some tiny detail the judges told me about that I actually myself can't even see. So judges tend to be picky. Do I really care? No, I'm glad that it won any kind of award that it did. But what preceded it was this particular piece that when I had started it, I was going to finish this for my mother, and I knew when I started it I'd never have it done. It's actually a Christmas piece. Some people sometimes don't notice that. And I started it. I gave her the picture of what it was supposed to look like for Christmas and said, next Christmas you'll get the whole thing, Mom. And I actually had only this middle part here. The mountains and the trees were done. And life got in the way. As John Lennon said, life happens while you're making other plans. And it sat in its frame, wrapped in tissue paper in my sewing studio for 14 years untouched. So in 2012, when I realized I had some time on my hands, I said, I really need to finish this because it was meant to be a Christmas gift for my mother. So I started stitching away on it. The unfortunate incident about it is I was almost done. I only had about a 4-inch square left of that corner to be completed when my mother had her first stroke. So unfortunately, I did finish it. I did come around and add this to this corner that says "I love my mother," because I really hoped she would recover. Unfortunately, when I finished it and brought it to the framers, my mother never lived to see it finished. And I always feel bad about that. She would have really liked to have seen this done. This is something that a lot of people don't understand. The Carousel Horse was done on white. This was done on a black background. So what you sometimes see in the picture as negative space is actually unstitched fabric. But it was designed well. It was designed very, very well to get the shading in there, to get the snow effects in there. This did win a first prize, and I was rather happy. I'm sorry my mother didn't get to see that prize, but it was nice to know that it can happen. This took me about 3 months. I think I started in September, finished it in November, went on to the Carousel Horse in the meantime in preparation for my last piece, which was pretty big. And I only know this because I knew we were going to get a blizzard. So I know I started this on February 9th, 2013, because that was the start of whatever blizzard that one was, and that's when I made the first stitch. This is, if you're familiar with tarot, because I say I am a tarot card designer and author, is the Magician card, and it's called homage to Pamela Coleman Smith, who was the lady who designed this piece and created the deck back in 1910. And this was quite an involved piece to get the floral work in, to make it all work. However, I decided I was not going to stitch a yellow background, use white fabric and stitch yellow over it, because I believe the unstitched part of all this is something like 50,000 stitches. And I was not going to spend 3 weeks just stitching 50,000 yellow stitches. Even I have my limits. But this piece did win at the Big E. It won a first prize. They wrote some really nice things about it. And I'm not exactly sure how they determined the massive, strange awards that are awarded by other sponsors. But some ladies' quilt guild, who I'm very, very thankful for, gave it an award for surface embroidery. So I have a big yellow rosette that went with this. I was very happy to hear that. I hope Pamela Coleman Smith, who's been dead since the early 1950s, appreciates the work I did. But all of this was prelude, these 3 pieces, to my next piece. Almost as soon as I finished that, I got prepped for this piece. And Sunday afternoon on the Isle of Grand Jatte. This is a massive painting. That's the original painting itself is actually close to 8 feet by 10 feet, reduced down to this size. A massive amount of details, a massive amount of work. I estimate now somewhere between 600 and 700 hours of work to produce this piece. This was a chart, which you can buy a chart that just gives you the grid of how things are and how big they are and what colors to use. And honestly and truly, I thought the chart was horrible. So when I started this piece, one of the things, in case you're not into art, is the reason this painting looks as beautiful as it does is because of Seurat's use of yellow. This chart had not a single stitch of yellow in it. So I ended up spending a lot of time online, going to the website for the Art Institute of Chicago and looking at the actual picture, which is hanging there, to get the details for it. Many things. There's a little tiny blob up here on the chart which looks like nothing, and it's actually a ferry boat with a French tricolor on the back. Well, on my piece it's a French tricolor. He added a border which was not part of the chart, and I had to create that by looking at the website. I'm very thankful. I actually contacted the Chicago Institute of Art and asked them what they thought, and they were very, very complimentary for this reinterpretation of Seurat's masterpiece. Of course, it does have a little joke hidden in it, which many people have never figured out yet, and that's down here at the bottom, is that Seurat is there painting the piece. He does not do that in the original painting. This is my only entry into the Eastern States Exposition for 2014. It took me about 6.5 months of work to get this piece done. And I'm really, really hoping that the judges like the joke, don't get upset because I've tampered with the masterpiece, appreciate the amount of work, the amount of stitching, and the quality of my stitching to produce this masterpiece from a masterpiece. It's one of probably the most complicated things I have ever had to stitch in my life. So wish me luck on that one, please, folks. Back again, talking about my costume designs. You might notice I've changed my shirt. It's the hottest day of the year. Thank you, Bob, to do this shoot. I've done professional costume design. I've done costume design for non-professional theater. I worked in a costume shop for about 7 years in Waterbury. And to tell you the truth, the reason I kind of made the jump from acting to costume design was technicians get paid, actors don't. So I basically moved into costuming, but it was always just part of what I did, which is sewing. Probably the most fun I had was right at the beginning when I started my costume design. I got a wonderful chance. These two friends of mine were directors at a local high school that did Jesus Christ Superstar. And what was even better about it is they didn't care what I did. So we got to do some really fun things that you might not get to do in professional theater. But it was the 80s, and we had to deal with certain things like these were high school students, the high priests. We did some crazy, crazy stuff because we just felt that, we could get away with doing certain costume things. But we really were in a quandary about what exactly to do with King Herod's number, because it's kind of a screamy number and a lot of funny things happen to it. So we decided we would go to a real big extreme. Don't forget, this is 1980, I don't remember now, 1984. So we did King Herod as Boy George. Brought down the house every single performance. Now it would probably look really ridiculously out of place, but in 1982 this was a screamer. But that was the fun part of costuming. All costuming is not as much fun as doing this. I mostly did Broadway show musicals. For a while at the end I was doing costume designs for a dance troupe. And if there's anything that will burn you out faster is having to create a single specialty costume for a dancer and then next year having to create a better than that special costume for the same dancer. Oh, you can get really, really tired. One of the largest shows I did work on, Evita for a friend of mine who was playing Evita at the time. But I did also work on a production of Showboat. Showboat, a show where the costuming never stops. There's, in a real production of Showboat, which goes from just after the Civil War up until, I think, the 1920s, depending on which version of the script you might be doing, there are, with a cast of 30 or 35, there's close to 300 to 400 costumes in that show. When you're the costume designer, they are your responsibility. Even if you're pulling them out of somebody's trunk somewhere, you're the costumer, you're in charge, you need to find them all. That can be a really complicated situation, but I did this production. It was a lot of fun. I did other big musicals. I did Hello Dolly for a dinner theater, which put people really up close. At least on a stage play, the actors are way down there somewhere on a stage, but in the dinner theater, those people are really sitting next to you and they really do see your costume details. I did a lot of theatrical costuming. I did a lot of masquerade costuming when I was working in the costume shop, but because I was a sewer, I'll get to these, because I was a sewer, making costumes, making clothing, for me were pretty much the same thing. And I'm also very, very proud to say anybody who wore a costume that I made for them, every single scene was finished, every single hem was done, and you could have walked down the street in any costume that I designed and made for you. And let me tell you, in non-professional theater, there are times when I've seen some pretty shoddy things go across the stage, but not in my productions, folks. I did do a production of Man of La Mancha, which was incredibly difficult. It was, and you figure these are people who are wearing rags most of the time. Even rags have to be designed. There's no way you can get around it. I got a lot of pictures of La Mancha. It was a really good show to do. I was also in it. I got stuck in it. When you can sing, you end up in musicals. I got to play the barber, even though I only had one scene. I did get a job teaching, not exactly teaching, but teaching, working on costumes at a private school that did 10 separate shows a year. I was their in-house costumer, and my first show with them was Equus. They did Amadeus, they did Shakespeare, they did many things. To produce 10 shows a year and be in charge of all of them was an incredible amount of work for me. I enjoyed every minute of it, but there comes a point when you finally say, I can't do this anymore. I cannot, sit here and design all these things. Technically, I have retired from costuming. There is a local theater that I work with. They come to me whenever they do a period show, 30s and 40s, because they really like me to take care of them. But when I lost my mother, I lost my sewing studio and lost the space to make all these costumes. So I retired from costuming. I donated almost everything to 2 local theaters, one that does a lot of Shakespeare and one that does not. And I gave away absolutely everything except my sewing machines, my thread, and one costume, my wizard costume that I've made myself, for myself, which I hope to be buried in. But everything else that I owned is long gone, and hopefully it's trotting across boards on other stages and other places. I still sew, I still help these friends do their costumes, but I no longer try to make a living from being a costume designer. Done a lot of quilts, wall hangings. I've done pillows, including this one, which might look familiar to some of you. Yes, this is called A Portrait of a Quilter as a Young Man, and I made it in 1981. We won't even talk about how long ago that was. I did a lot of quilt pillows. Like this one also. Sometimes you really don't want to do a whole quilt. Sometimes some quilt shows don't want to see gigantic quilts from everybody, and you make these little sample-y things, but you still can get all sorts of notices and awards for it. But this was one of my favorites, and no, this is not for sale. You cannot take me home and sleep with me. Wall hanging I made specifically for my parents' home. This was called And I Wish Every Night was the 4th of July, which I think was the title of a made-for-TV movie at the time. It's a block called Flyfoot Fret. It's a very old pattern, but I did this in hopes that you would see it as fireworks exploding in the night sky. It's sort of kind of very Van Gogh's Starry Night looking. This, because I know someone's going to ask, no, everything I've ever made that is quilted is hand pieced together and hand quilted. So when you see, hope this shows up on the video, when you see this, this is all hand done. There's no machine stitching anywhere except for the bindings on my quilts, because some things are just not worth doing by hand. But it was a nice piece. It was hung in my parents' home for about 28 years until both of them passed away. And of course now, once again, I own it. It faded gracefully, but it was a nice piece. I had a lot of fun showing it because it also doesn't take up a lot of space, unlike what I'm going to show you next. This is my modern take on what is called a Victorian crazy quilt. If you understand, it's a bunch of blocks put together. It's a square block with a fan in one corner called grandmother's fan. I laid this out and planned it so that the black satin band of the fans would make this serpentine border all the way through it, and of course make the circle in the middle of the bed. This is where I learned to do a lot of the embroidery stitches that I've used for many things, including my cross stitch. It was a very fun piece to work on because you could work on an entire individual block without having, massive amounts of fabric around you. Done as 36 separate blocks. You could just take a block with you, odd moments of time waiting for the banker to get to you, waiting for the bus to come, waiting for whatever. You could sit there and do the embroidery, and then once they were all put together, they were put into strips and then turned into this quilt, which has this extremely screamy bright blue border on the back. Pretty heavy piece for a quilt that's not really full size. It was exhibited at, I don't even know now anymore how many shows. It's won various prizes. Almost all my quilts have won at least one prize. But the three quilts, there's a quilt top at the bottom, all at least have won at least one Best of Show ribbon, because as you probably have guessed, I can sew very, very well. This is a very complicated and very bright quilt, which contrasts really very much with the quilt that's underneath it, which is a rather simple quilt in a very large size. This pattern is called a double Irish chain. It's basically nothing but squares. This quilt, I think, is king size. I planned this out. It was exhibited at many quilt shows and fairs, and one of the oddest things about this quilt is it probably has won more prizes for me than any of my other quilts, considering it's a rather simple quilt. But it's won more prizes for me, but it was never ever photographed for a magazine. And almost all of my quilts appeared at one point in Quilter's World, Quilt, any of the periodicals of the day, because I used to write for those. But we'll talk about my writing career in another segment. Nice quilt if you have any Irish ancestry in you. Ruby red, kind of mint green on a plain background, and when you can see the quilting of it on the back. Rather large size. I did have it appraised. Yes, all of my quilts are for sale, but they all have 4-digit price tags on them, and this one does too. Not the largest quilt I've ever made. What's underneath it is, voila, the 12 Days of Christmas as a quilt. It actually was inspired from a design by a Christmas card by Hallmark. Have to give them credit for it. But of course it didn't look anything like this on the Christmas card. This is appliqued. All of the other quilts that I've made are pieced, where edges were sewed together and butted against each other, and there were squares and triangles. This is applique. All of these shapes had to be cut out, edges folded under, sewn down, sewn onto a block, assembled, and then quilted. This is a big piece. I don't know if you can see it, but There's holly leaves and holly berries in the borders. It's bordered in red. The long borders on this quilt do say the 12 Days of Christmas in Old English script, because it is an Old English carol. I almost had a near disaster with this quilt. I tried using, to get the lettering, I was using a supposed to be washable marking system, and you're supposed to just, stitch through it, wet it, it would disappear. It was not disappearing. It was just making a mess. I tried as best as I could to keep it from looking bad. I sent this quilt to the National Quilt Association show in New Orleans that year, and went to New Orleans to see it. And it wasn't until I saw this quilt hanging up on a display and said, "Oh God, it looks dirty." It really did, and it was the marker, because the water only carried it so far. So I only got, I think, a second prize or a third prize for this at a national quilt show because it looked dirty. So I ended up buying some quilt soap. They make such a thing. At the quilt show, brought this home, held my heart in my mouth, and put this in a bathtub of warm, soapy water, which cleaned all the stains out. Lesson learned. Unfortunately, it's like, I don't want to make this quilt get wet. This quilt has never been used. It's only been on display. It's never been slept under. It's never been touched. It has been kept as this way as best as I can. And it was appraised at an even grand. And that was 20 years ago. So I'm sure it has increased in price. This is probably the next to largest quilt I've ever completed. And yes, when you see the back, yes, this is entirely quilted by hand in a frame. There's no machine quilting in this. I should say, because I have to give a picture to Bob about it, I do have a quilt that is in the International Quilt Study Museum in the University of Lincoln, Nebraska. It was purchased by two quilt collectors, and when they decided to stop collecting after I don't know how many years, they donated most of their collection and $1 million to build the building to house them, and my quilt went with them. I don't have any pictures of it. They bought it from me practically right after it was made, but I do have a quilt that is preserved in a museum, and I'm kind of hoping I can convince them maybe they should become the home for the rest of these quilts, because I made the last quilts of these I made in the 1980s. This is only the episode about my sewing. I do have one about my work as an author, and I did illustrate one of my children's books myself. And there's also a couple of special features that we're also going to film that will only be available on the Apremont website. But I thank you very, very much for watching this segment. Thank you very much.